Welcome to Tunisia 1943, where the desert still whispers the sound of gunfire, and a soldier they buried is said to still be standing guard. The story begins not with triumph, but with disbelief. When engineers from the 9th Infantry returned to the ridge 3 days after the fighting stopped, they found 31 bodies scattered across the sands, rifles locked in position, helmets, half-buried faces turned toward the east. And at the center, one figure remained upright, motionless, as if frozen in time. His uniform stiff with dust and blood, his eyes open, his finger still curled around the trigger of a Browning. The wind hissed through the metal and the dunes as if carrying the last command that had bound him there. They called it Hill 609, a nameless ridge near Kasserine carved by artillery soaked with oil and sweat. For 3 days it was the edge of hell, and when it was over, men swore they had seen something that defied the laws of war, a platoon that refused to fall even in death. Local shepherds later claimed that for weeks after at night, they could see a figure standing against the moonlight, unmoving, guarding something unseen. The Germans had advanced past it. The Americans had left, but one silhouette remained. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Tell us what you feel when you hear this, a soldier who kept his post beyond the grave. Was it disciplined faith or something that even time couldn't erase? February 1943, Tunisia. The wind was thick with sand and engine smoke. Allied convoys crawled along the Gafsa road, the sound of diesel and prayer mixing in the air. The war had shifted. Africa was no longer just a desert campaign. It was the testing ground of the future war machine. In the distance, Rommel's Afrika Korps moved like a storm, precise, patient, deadly. And standing in their way was a handful of men from the 34th Infantry, young, tired, most of them barely trained, holding a position no one remembered ordering them to hold. It began before dawn. A faint glimmer of headlights, the low rumble of panzer engines echoing through the hills. Sergeant Riley, the radio operator, had scribbled one last line before static swallowed the signal. "They're coming in waves. We won't make it to sunrise." No one ever heard from him again. By the time reinforcements arrived, the ridge was silent. Burned-out vehicles, the smell of cordite sand melted into glass. And then that soldier, the one still standing. His name, according to the tag half-welded to his chest, was Private Elijah Carter, 23, Alabama. His unit had been reported entirely lost in action. Yet somehow, there he was, upright weapon locked in firing position. Forensics later confirmed rigor mortis had set in mid-action, his body literally seized while he was still shooting. It wasn't a statue. It wasn't luck. It was something else. Something that made even battle-hardened men remove their helmets. The report filed by Lieutenant Maynard of the recovery team reads, "Subject found in firing stance. Sand frozen around boots. Gun barrel warped by heat. Expression unreadable." He paused before writing the last line. He died standing, and that became legend. The soldier who wouldn't fall. The soldier still on guard. In the years that followed, locals placed pebbles at the site as offerings, as if paying tribute to a spirit that refused to yield. Platoon. Picture the scene, the sky bruised purple from smoke and dawnlight, the air trembling with the aftershock of mortars. A lone ridge surrounded by burnt palms, the echo of machine gun belts rattling in the wind. You can almost hear the breath of the men, short and sharp, their helmets slick with sweat. The sound of sand scraping under boots. The clicking of empty magazines. It's not heroism you feel here, it's something raw, instinctive, primal. The will to hold a line even when there's no one left to witness it. Back at headquarters, confusion turned to silence when the field report came in. "How can a man die like that?" someone muttered. He didn't, another replied. He just stopped moving. In the fog of war, facts turn into myth, and myth becomes the only way soldiers can make sense of what they've seen. But here, the lines blurred. The coroner's note described nerve contractions at the moment of death, muscles locking in defense. Yet those who saw him said his eyes weren't vacant. They were fixed, alert, almost waiting. The desert has a way of holding stories. The wind carries them across dunes, smoothing away the details but leaving behind the shape of truth. And every war leaves one a shape that doesn't fade, a moment that refuses to end. On Hill 609, that moment was Carter. The platoon had been buried, but one man seemed to have decided his duty wasn't finished. Imagine the heat, 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the taste of iron in your mouth, the vibration of tank shells tearing the air apart. Orders screamed, then drowned by gunfire. Your world reduced to dust and adrenaline. You look left, your friend is gone. You look right, the line is collapsing. And yet you keep your sight locked forward because somewhere deep down there's a promise that you can't break, you don't run. Not here, not today. And that's what they found. Not courage as the world defines it, but defiance against the impossible. One platoon that held long enough to delay a German column by nearly 30 hours, long enough for the Allied armor at Tebessa to regroup. Military historians call it a tactical anomaly. Locals call it the night the dead stood watch. The truth may live somewhere in between. The body was sent back stateside months later, but something stayed behind. Soldiers who passed through the area in later campaigns wrote letters home saying they felt uneasy near the ridge. One sergeant from the 1st Armored Division noted in his diary, "It felt like we were being watched." Another wrote, "The air's too still here," as if someone's keeping count. War records, folklore, science, they all intersect at that ridge. And so when people speak of Tunisia 1943, they don't talk about Rommel's tactics or Patton's advance, they talk about the man who died standing. The one who refused to fall. The one whose shadow still faces east when the sun sets behind the dunes. This is not just a story of war, it's a story of endurance that bends the line between flesh and spirit. Of how sometimes the body breaks, but the duty doesn't. Of a forgotten platoon that history erased except for the one man who refused to leave his post. So before we go further, pause for a second. Listen. Maybe you'll hear it too, the faint clatter of a spent casing rolling across the sand. The whisper of boots in formation long after the men who wore them have gone. Because somewhere in that desert, under the endless heat and the indifferent sky, a soldier is still standing guard. And he hasn't moved in 80 years. ChatGPT said, February 1943. Tunisia trembled beneath the weight of engines and dust. The war in North Africa had turned into a vast, burning maze, each ridge, each valley a pocket of confusion, where orders vanished faster than radio signals. The sun rose heavy red, like a wound casting long shadows over convoys that crawled through sand-choked roads. Trucks overloaded with ammunition groaned through the Gafsa Pass, their drivers squinting against the glare, their thoughts far away from Europe or Washington. This was not the glamorous war the newspapers promised. This was heat, dehydration, cracked lips, and the stench of oil mixed with fear. The wind carried every sound, boots dragging engines, misfiring men, coughing into scarves, as if the desert itself were alive and listening. At headquarters in Tebessa, maps curled at the edges from humidity. Lines drawn in pencil shifted daily one day, red for German control, next day, blue for Allied hope. Officers argued over terrain they'd never seen, tracing circles around names like Kasserine, Faid, Speit La Gafsa, hills and wadis that meant nothing until someone died there. The radio room was a constant hum of static. Enemy armor advancing west. Request immediate air cover. We're falling back. The rhythm was relentless, code, pause, silence, and then a new voice breaking through, breathless. Somewhere beyond those coordinates, real men were moving, fighting, collapsing. The command staff called them units, but to the desert, they were just noise. The Africa Corps had perfected motion. They struck like a sandstorm, swift, deceptive, vanishing before you could counterattack. Rommel's reputation wasn't just myth. It was momentum made flesh. His columns moved with mathematical precision, fuel timing terrain. Every shell counted, every maneuver measured. Against him stood the Americans, fresh, eager, but untested. Their tanks were slower, their coordination rough, their confidence fragile. The British veterans of years of desert war watched with weary amusement. They'd learned already arrogance dies fast under African sun. Somewhere between Faid and Kasserine, the 34th Infantry Division dug into a stretch of high ground, the maps barely mentioned. Hill 609, nothing remarkable, just another number among thousands. Yet it overlooked a narrow corridor where the German supply lines threaded through the dunes. Whoever held that ridge could slow Rommel's thrust toward Tebessa, maybe buy time for the Allied flanks to regroup. It was a textbook assignment: hold until relieved. But relief would never come. The message had gone out late, lost in static, buried under reports of advancing panzers. When the platoon climbed the ridge, they thought it was temporary, a few hours, maybe a day. They didn't know the entire line behind them had already begun to crumble. Morning came bright and merciless. The horizon shimmered with mirages that looked like water, but tasted of despair. Men tightened their helmets, dug foxholes with shaking hands. Sergeant Mills muttered prayers under his breath, while Corporal Jones counted rations: 2 tins of beans, half a canteen each, a handful of cigarettes. They joked at first, trading bets on when reinforcements would arrive. The laughter was dry, hollow, a defense against the knowledge that the sky itself might soon turn against them. From the valley below came a deep metallic growl. The men turned toward the sound, the unmistakable rumble of panzer engines. Dust clouds lifted like ghosts, spreading wider, darker. Through binoculars, Carter spotted movement tanks in formation, smaller shapes flanking on either side, infantry mounted on half-tracks. He exhaled slowly. "They're coming straight for us." The radio crackled once, twice, then silence. Riley banged it with his fist. "Signal's dead." A curse, then orders. "Positions, set the gun, load belts." The air changed texture, thick with anticipation, and then it began. Artillery thundered from somewhere beyond the horizon. The first shell landed 30 yards short, spraying sand like water. The second found a trench. A flash, a roar, and 2 men vanished. The ground shook with each impact, shockwaves rolling through the ridge, rattling helmets, making teeth chatter. The men of Hill 609 answered with rifles, mortars, machine guns, anything they had. Each burst disappeared into the vastness, swallowed by dust. But they kept firing. The rhythm of defense became mechanical: aim, fire, reload, duck, breathe. Minutes turned to hours. The line held barely. Carter's Browning roared without pause. The barrel glowed faintly red, the belt feeding through his hands like a living thing. Shells rained, men shouted, the radio screamed static. Somewhere behind him, Mills was yelling into a broken handset, "Where's the air support?" "We can't hold," but the sky offered no reply, only the buzz of circling flies. By midday, the heat was unbearable. The trench walls crumbled under blast after blast. The wounded begged for water. The living had none to give. Jones was hit, shoulder torn open. He kept firing one-handed until the bolt jammed. Another man laughed hysterically, tearing open a ration can with his teeth. The sound of madness mingled with the smell of cordite. Yet amid that chaos, something extraordinary happened. They refused to retreat. Every instinct said run, but no one moved. It wasn't bravery. It was inertia forged by fear and training. When you've nowhere to go, you hold. Rommel's reports later called it unexpected resistance. For 3 days, the ridge stalled an entire column. On the second night, tracer rounds painted the dunes red and green like fireworks for ghosts. The sky pulsed with silent lightning artillery flashes reflecting off sandstorms. Communication lines were gone, supply lines cut, yet still they fought. Each man isolated yet bound by a single invisible thread: don't let them pass. Behind the front, the Allied command scrambled. Patton's reinforcements were days away. Airfields at Thalept and Lekef buzzed with exhausted pilots refueling, listening to garbled distress signals. The phrase "Hill 609 holding" came through, once faint, then vanished. No one knew who sent it. Maybe it was Carter. Maybe it was static shaped into hope. The Germans advanced with cold precision. Their officers didn't underestimate courage, but they trusted physics more. Steel momentum firepower, these win wars. Yet as they climbed that ridge, something felt off. Bodies didn't flee. They stiffened. Machine guns barked from positions already obliterated. Mortars fired from trenches that no longer existed. One German lieutenant later wrote in his diary, recovered from the field, "They fought as if they had no tomorrow, perhaps because they truly didn't." On the third day, the sky broke open. Rain, a rare gift in Tunisia, fell in short, violent bursts mixing with ash. Mud replaced sand. The ridge turned slick, treacherous. The last defenders huddled around their dwindling ammunition, their faces streaked with grime and disbelief. Private Carter cleaned his Browning one final time, whispering something no one heard. When the enemy came again, he rose from cover and fired until the belt ran out. His last burst tore through the haze, cutting silhouettes out of the storm. Then silence. The ridge fell. By nightfall, Rommel's tanks rolled past the wreckage without slowing. To them, it was another bump on the march toward Tebessa. But the pause, those 30 hours, would echo louder than they realized. Allied armor regrouped, airstrikes recalibrated, and within weeks, the tide shifted. Yet the desert doesn't record victories the way history books do. It remembers sound and scent. The hiss of sand hitting metal, the faint tang of burned oil, the whisper of men whose names fade but whose presence lingers. Hill 609 was now just coordinates on a map, but for those who survived nearby, it became something else, a boundary between logic and myth. Villagers passing the ridge at dawn spoke of shapes in the mist, shadows too rigid to be human, glints of metal where no wreckage remained. Some said they heard the rhythmic click of a machine gun on windless nights. Others claimed the sand near the crest never settled, as if stirred by unseen boots. Military patrols dismissed it as superstition, but even hardened officers walked faster near the site. Back at base, reports trickled in, accounts too strange to file properly. One body found upright read the note. Weapons still locked, safety off. No explanation followed. The clerk who typed it left the last line blank. The file number ended abruptly, smudged by sweat. That's the nature of war. In the desert. It blurs fact and faith until you can't tell where one ends. The heat distorts everything, sound, distance, memory. A radio crack becomes a cry for help. A mirage becomes a man still standing. But the ridge was real. The platoon was real. And the legend that would rise from its ashes was as tangible as the sand beneath a boot. As the sun set over Tunisia, the sky turned the color of rust. The wind howled through broken helmets and twisted barrels, carrying with it fragments of voices, half prayer, half warning. And somewhere among them, unseen but unmistakable, stood the echo of a man who refused to fall. His posture perfect, his purpose unbroken, his watch eternal. And as night swallowed the ridge, only the stars bore witness to what remained. The morning after the ridge fell, silence hung over Tunisia like a physical weight. The smoke had drifted east. The sound of engines faded, but the ground still trembled faintly, as if the earth remembered. A reconnaissance team was dispatched at first light. Their orders simple: recover dog tags, count bodies, and report positions. They expected chaos. They found something worse: stillness. 31 men precisely where they'd fought, each in the position described in their field manual, as if obeying orders even in death. Rifles in hands, bayonets fixed, eyes turned east, and one of them, one still standing. The report began clinically, as all military documents do. Coordinates, temperature, visibility, estimated casualties. But then the tone shifted. Subject: Carter Elijah, position upright. Gun welded to hand by heat. No sign of post-mortem interference. Expression neutral. The officer in charge hesitated before writing the next line. Appears to be standing watch. Later he would tell colleagues that the desert wind seemed to bend around the body, as if unwilling to touch it. They took photographs, grainy, harsh, then covered him gently, not because protocol demanded it, but because something about the scene made them whisper. Back at Tebessa, the photographs spread through the camp like contraband. Some stared at them in disbelief, others in reverence. A man who died standing. It sounded like a fable from centuries ago, not from last week's battlefield. The chaplain requested a full burial service. The medical examiner requested an autopsy. The commanding officer refused both until headquarters confirmed the facts. He's still on duty. One sergeant joked darkly, but no one laughed. Even the Germans who later examined captured American reports added a note in their own archives. An American machine gunner killed while upright, symbol of stubborn resistance. Rommel himself, ever the soldier's soldier, is rumored to have remarked, "That man understood war better than most generals, yet facts demand structure, and structure demands evidence." So the doctors began their work. They thawed the frozen grip, measured muscle tension, studied the carbon scoring on his weapon. Every detail pointed to a man who refused surrender at the cellular level. Rigor mortis had set mid-action. His last act wasn't collapse, it was aim. The medical report read, death by fragmentation wound, instantaneous cardiac arrest. But the timeline contradicted it. He'd remained upright for hours afterward. Logic buckled. Biology had limits, but something beyond biology had anchored him there. Meanwhile, the rest of the platoon's story began to unfold through fragments, letters, diaries, fragments of radio logs. Private Hensley's notebook survived in a tin ration box. The last page read, if we hold, they can't reach Tebessa. We'll buy time. Tell Ma the desert's quiet tonight. Too quiet. Another note unsigned scribbled on a torn map. Carter says he'll keep watch. Says someone has to. These were not words of men expecting salvation. They were confessions written to the wind. Fact became more than numbers. It became proof of impossibility. According to logistics records, Hill 609 was supposed to fall in 20 minutes. It held for 72 hours. The official casualty rate exceeded 70%. Ammunition stocks listed as depleted still showed burn marks on weapons long after they should have cooled. The War Department analysts back home called it an anomaly. Field officers called it faith. And somewhere between the two, a legend took root. Tunisia's villagers soon learned the story, through whispers passed between supply convoys and Red Cross drivers. They began to leave stones along the roadside near the ridge, a local tradition to honor the unburied. Soon there were hundreds. British engineers clearing wreckage reported hearing the sound of metal tapping at night, though no patrols were recorded. They dismantled every remaining weapon on the ridge to silence it. Still, the tapping continued. In nearby Gafsa, a French priest attached to the Allied relief mission documented his visit. I walked among the graves and felt the air press upon me. The sand here does not settle. It moves like breath. He placed a cross in the ground near the center trench, unaware he was marking Carter's exact position. Years later, when the cross fell, locals replaced it with a pile of stones, then a small wooden stake, then nothing at all. But the shape of the ground, slightly raised like a man's chest rising from beneath, remained unchanged. Military historians revisiting the site decades later brought instruments, scanners, all the precision of modern science. They mapped the terrain, measured metal residues, tracked magnetic anomalies. One of them, a young researcher from Oxford, noticed something strange, a faint vertical alignment of metallic particles beneath the surface, as if something once magnetized the soil in the shape of a human outline. It could be coincidence or the echo of wartime debris. But when he placed his hand over the spot, his compass needle twitched east. Fact bled into folklore again. The Allied records confirmed that Carter's platoon delay gave enough time for Patton's forces to establish a counterline near El Guetar, a maneuver that shifted the North African campaign. One platoon officially lost in action had unknowingly helped alter the entire momentum of the war. Yet no commendation followed. Bureaucracy forgot them. The ridge was marked cleared. The bodies were moved to a collective grave in Bone, Algeria. But Carter's file stayed open, flagged with a note, re-examine body positioning anomaly. It would remain unresolved until the archive was declassified decades later. And still the witnesses spoke. A driver from the 1st Armored Division swore that in 1944, months after the battle, he passed the ridge at night and saw a figure in uniform near the old trench. He stopped, shouted no response. The next morning, no footprints, no signs of life. A patrol from the French Foreign Legion reported a similar sighting in 1946. By then, everyone called it the Watcher. Even Rommel's retreating troops, superstitious after years of desert war, avoided the ridge. Der Wachsam, the Watchful One, became their whispered warning. But beneath the layers of myth, the documents tell a simpler truth. The human body can endure what the mind cannot imagine. The platoon's stand wasn't supernatural. It was the final expression of duty when reason has burned away. The men of Hill 609 fought not for glory, but for rhythm, breathe, aim, fire, survive one more second. And in that rhythm, they transcended orders. Carter's story became a training legend years later. In Army briefings, instructors would tell recruits, discipline means doing your job even when you're already gone. Most thought it a metaphor. Only a few officers knew it was literal. Yet the deeper you look, the harder it is to draw the line between physics and faith. Why did the radio still transmit for hours after the operator died? Why did the machine gun fire intervals match the pattern of Carter's known firing cadence? Why did the last transmission from the ridge recorded at Aero 214 contain a faint voice saying, "Still holding"? The official report lists it as interference from nearby Allied frequencies. But sound technicians decades later analyzed the waveform it matched no known transmission source. When the desert wind blows over Hill 609 today, you can still hear the hiss through a radio scanner, a low pulse, irregular but steady. Some say it's just magnetic residue. Others are not so sure, because war is more than bullets and orders. It's memory imprinted into the land, into the metal, into the silence. And sometimes those memories take shape again, standing where they last stood watching the horizon. That's the fact beneath the folklore, the physics of haunting. The body may fall, but duty vibrates through the soil. The War Department closed Carter's file in 1948. The final entry read, "No further inquiry necessary," but under the signature, someone anonymous had added a single sentence in pencil: "He's still watching." He's still. That line was erased before the file went to archive. But even erasures leave traces. And somewhere in that desert, under the same sun that burned the world 80 years ago, a wind still shifts east every dawn, as if saluting a man who never turned away. By the fourth day, the sun over Tunisia rose pale and cold, as if exhausted by the heat and horror it had watched. The battle had ended, but its echo refused to fade. The recovery teams were replaced by investigators, photographers, priests, and silence. Each came to Hill 609 with their own mission, some seeking closure, some seeking data, and a few seeking meaning. The sand had begun to swallow the trenches, yet the lines remained visible like scars refusing to heal. And in the center of it all, Private Elijah Carter's footprint, singular, defined, faced east where the morning light struck his rusted gun. The men who buried him were not strangers. They were survivors from the 9th Engineers, hardened veterans who'd seen more than enough death to stop feeling it. But something about this burial unsettled them. One, a corporal named Leonard Bryce, later wrote in his pocket diary, "We had to pry his boots loose. The sand had fused around them like concrete. We pulled, but it felt wrong, like trying to wake someone who wasn't supposed to wake up. They dug a shallow trench," said the standard prayer, "and covered him, yet none could bring themselves to mark the spot. Not because they forgot, but because they couldn't decide what to write. Name, rank, or something else entirely, something that belonged to both the living and the dead." Days later, the wind shifted and unearthed the edge of the grave again. Locals passing by reported seeing cloth fluttering through the sand, olive green, torn, yet unrotted. A French officer stationed nearby ordered the site sealed, citing unexplained disturbances in field communications. Radios crackled endlessly when near the ridge, and compasses spun off alignment. His men joked about ghosts, but by the third malfunction no one was laughing. Machines, it seemed, remembered too. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, in offices far from the dust, the story turned into data. Washington received the dispatch with confusion. "Man found standing at death," one report summarized as if summarizing a myth. A colonel in charge of the casualty division scrawled across the margin, "Verify claim sounds like battlefield hysteria." But photos arrived soon after, grainy, undeniable. One showed Carter's silhouette at sunset, rifle-angled posture, perfect. Another showed engineers removing the body, their faces blurred not by camera motion, but by dust or shame. The colonel filed the images quietly, marking them restricted. In hospitals from Iran to Algiers, survivors from neighboring units began to talk. They'd heard rumors of a platoon that had held the ridge longer than physics allowed. Some said they'd seen flares above the desert even after the date of their confirmed deaths. One medic swore he found a note written on a scrap of ration paper, days later dry, clean, unweathered. It read only, "Still on watch." The handwriting matched Carter's earlier letters home. Scientists later dismissed it as coincidence. Soldiers didn't. Among those soldiers was Lieutenant Miles Jensen, who had once commanded Carter's platoon before being reassigned. When he received word of their stand, he refused to believe it. "Those boys barely had enough ammo for a day," he said. "They shouldn't have lasted an hour." But when shown the autopsy reports, he grew quiet. "That's him," he murmured. "He always said if he ever went, he'd go standing." The interviewer decades later would pause when recalling the look in Jensen's eyes, half pride, half guilt. The ridge became a forbidden landmark after that. Patrols passed around it, engineers avoided digging near it. Each year, sandstorms tried to erase it, but always something about its outline re-emerged, the faint impression of trenches, the slight elevation of what had once been Carter's position. Even now, satellite imagery shows an uneven ridge that the desert refuses to level. No one builds there. The nomads say it's cursed. The veterans say it's sacred. Maybe both are right. Years after the war, when memorial plaques were erected for North African campaigns, the 34th Infantry's Hill 609 engagement was listed only as delaying action. No names, no commendations. But unofficially, soldiers called it the watch post. At reunions, old men with medals they never wanted would tell the story quietly over whiskey, how one platoon stood their ground so long that the enemy began to fear the silence itself. And every time someone would lower their voice near the end and say, "And that one man, he's still there." The laughter that followed was never genuine. Science tried to reclaim the legend. In 1961, a military historian and physiologist named Dr. Raymond Hughes revisited the site. His goal to prove it was all a physiological coincidence, rigor mortis misinterpreted by shaken soldiers. He measured soil temperature, examined declassified photos, reconstructed the firing angle of Carter's Browning. His conclusion was careful clinical. Under extreme stress, neuromuscular contraction may result in partial upright fixation post-mortem. But later in a private letter to his wife, he wrote a different sentence. "I stood there and felt watched. Something remains in that soil that isn't physics." Hughes wasn't alone. Over the next decades, journalists, ghost hunters, and veterans returned. Each brought technology, Geiger counters, magnetic detectors, EMF readers. Each left unsettled. Readings spiked inexplicably when pointed east, toward the same direction Carter had faced. Some heard static that shaped itself into words, fragments like hold or not done. The skeptics blamed signal interference. The believers didn't care for explanations. For the people who lived near Kasserine, the story became part of their landscape. Children born years after the war grew up hearing it as a parable told by grandfathers under moonlight, about a soldier who defied death because duty had become stronger than the flesh. They called him Al-Raqib, the Watcher. Shepherds claimed that on certain nights, their dogs would refuse to climb the ridge, tails, low, ears flat. The air there felt charged, heavy, too aware. When film crews arrived in the 1980s to shoot a documentary about forgotten battles, they set up camp near Hill 609. The director dismissed the local warnings. On the second night, their generator shut down. Every battery drained within hours. Cameras recorded static, but through that static came frames 3, maybe 4, of a figure in uniform, standing perfectly still, half illuminated by lightning. The production stopped. The footage was confiscated by the military before airing. No one ever explained why. In the archives of the U.S. Army War College, tucked behind hundreds of routine battle reports, sits a thin folder labeled simply Platoon 609. Inside, faded memos, photos, and an unsigned statement written in pencil. One man kept his post. Recommend no further inquiry. Some things serve better as legend. That folder hasn't been reopened in years, but the image from it circulates quietly online. Carter's silhouette against the desert light, his rifle forming a line straight toward the horizon. Some historians argue that myth is how soldiers heal, that legends give meaning to senseless loss. Perhaps they're right, but others believe certain events cross the threshold between record and memory, becoming a kind of echo that refuses to die. On Hill 609, that echo hums in the static of broken radios and in the wind that shifts east each morning. It hums in every story told by the survivors who can't explain why they still wake at night hearing machine gun bursts that no longer exist. And so the myth persists, not because people want it to, but because the desert does. It remembers. It replays. The sand carries each sound like a record etched in glass, the thump of shells, the cry of orders, the click of a Browning, the single heartbeat between defiance and death. Those who stand on that ridge today swear the air feels different there, denser, charged, as if the atoms themselves were listening for commands. Perhaps that's the truth of war, that sometimes duty outlives the man. Carter's body is gone, his name reduced to a footnote in a forgotten campaign. But the idea of him, the image of a soldier, refusing to kneel, refusing to turn away, remains indestructible. And maybe that's why no monument has ever been built there. Because the desert doesn't need one. The ridge itself is the monument. As the years pass, technology changes, borders shift, but Hill 609 remains untouched. Each dawn, the first beam of sunlight hits the same patch of ground where Carter once stood. The locals say that's no coincidence that the earth still angles toward him, acknowledging its last century. Whether physics or faith, it endures. The war ended in 1943, but the watch continues. And somewhere in that silence beyond reason, beyond explanation, he is still there. By the time the historians began to untangle the facts from the myths, Hill 609 had already slipped beyond the reach of ordinary language. Reports were contradictory, dates blurred, and the soldiers who might have clarified the truth were either buried or long silent. But in the files that survived, pages yellowed by desert heat, one could trace the slow realization that something at that ridge had rewritten the logic of war. For months after the battle, headquarters at Algiers struggled to understand how 30 men had managed to halt an armored division. The official story called it a strategic delay. The numbers told a different tale, an impossibility measured in hours and lives. The first contrast came from the intelligence logs. Rommel's offensive that February was supposed to roll unbroken through central Tunisia, cutting off the Allied supply chain and forcing a retreat toward Algeria. His timetable was precise. By the morning of February 19th, his armor should have breached Tebessa. Instead, radio intercepts from the Africa Corps recorded a strange pause. At 02:00 hours, a message, resistance heavier than expected, advancing slowed. At 08:30, another still engaged infantry, not yielding. And at 13:00, casualties, unacceptable, request regroup. These were not routine delays, they were the cracks in momentum that changed the shape of campaigns. When the War Department analyzed those transmissions weeks later, one analyst drew a line on the map, connecting the coordinates. They all pointed to Hill 609. A single ridge, he wrote, held off Rommel's thrust for 29 hours and 56 minutes. Numbers turned into shock. That span of time allowed reinforcements from the 1st Armored Division to reposition Allied aircraft, to rearm and defensive lines at Tebessa to solidify. Without it, North Africa might have fallen differently, perhaps even prolonged the entire war. The map of victory depended on one forgotten platoon and the man who refused to fall. But there was more. The technical logs recorded something anomalous. German panzer commanders reported malfunctioning optics and misaligned rangefinders during the assault on the ridge. Equipment checked afterward showed no defects. Theories ranged from sand interference to atmospheric distortion, yet nothing could explain why mechanical precision failed in that one pocket of terrain. Visibility collapsed at 50 yards, wrote a captured officer. We fired blind. Allied soldiers, by contrast, described unnatural clarity, seeing enemy movements lit by flashes that seemed to come from nowhere. To the men in the trenches, it felt as if the air itself had chosen sides. By late spring, the engineers returned to the site to recover what they could. Among the wreckage, they found shell fragments fused into the sand casings embedded in glassy soil. But one discovery puzzled them, a line of footprints leading up the ridge, stopping abruptly at the crest, no sign of retreat. Every print was sharp, symmetrical, as though preserved intentionally. At the end of that path lay the shattered Browning Carter had used. The weapon was fused solid, its barrel warped by heat so intense that even the steel looked scorched from within. Metallurgists later confirmed the firing temperature exceeded anything achievable through conventional use. The gun had burned itself out, yet remained intact, locked in firing position. When scientists tested soil samples decades later, they found traces of magnetized particles aligned in a single direction, east. The readings puzzled them. The field strength was too low for ordnance residue, but too precise for chance. Some speculated it was the lingering effect of artillery shockwaves. Others quietly called it a signature, a physical echo of the energy once focused through that weapon, through that man. The Army's own analysts compiled a comparative report, between the American and German positions, calling it Fact Layer 2, the turn. On paper, it was about technology and logistics. The Germans had precision tanks, superior coordination, and veteran crews. The Americans had improvised defenses, poor communication, and half the firepower. Yet outcomes inverted expectation. It was as if the mathematics of warfare had momentarily bent, outproduced, outflanked, outgunned, yet somehow they'd outlasted. The report's closing sentence read, "Victory delayed, not denied, result unknown." That bureaucratic phrasing hid the truth. They didn't understand what had happened. Back in Washington, the Office of War Information debated how to present the incident to the public. They couldn't tell the full story without invoking superstition, but they couldn't ignore it either. Eventually, they buried it under bland phrasing. Elements of the 34th Division engaged the enemy under heavy pressure, delaying the advance. A single line in a 1943 communiqué replaced 72 hours of hell. The platoon's names vanished into archives, their medals unissued, their valor unspoken. The world moved on, only the desert remembered. Years later, declassified documents revealed the quiet acknowledgement between opposing sides. A German staff memo dated March 1943 noted American resistance at Hill 609 unusually determined. Morale analysis, irrational persistence. The phrase irrational persistence appeared again in Allied briefings, this time as praise. It became code for acts beyond explanation, moments when men fought past logic. Carter's stand became the template for an entire philosophy of endurance. Technological progress continued its march, turning the war into a contest of machinery. Yet the lesson from that ridge lingered. Tactics manuals began to include the term fixed-point defense, the concept of holding key terrain through psychological rather than material dominance. Few realized the doctrine originated from Hill 609. The analysts who coined it had studied Carter's engagement and concluded that morale could distort even superior firepower. "A single human," one strategist wrote, "can alter the efficiency of mechanical systems through unpredictability." It sounded poetic, almost mystical, but numbers supported it. Among the veterans, the story evolved differently. They didn't talk about morale. They talked about the look. The expression in Carter's eyes that morning, the calm before the storm, the steady refusal. Every man who'd seen it said the same. It wasn't rage or panic. It was focus so complete, it erased fear. In their memories, that focus spread through the platoon like contagion. They stopped thinking about surviving and started thinking about holding. In that shift, they transcended the battlefield. Decades later, military psychologists tried to replicate the state of mind, recorded in posthumous accounts. They called it kinetic trance, a condition where adrenaline and duty fuse into sustained hyper-awareness. Experiments failed to recreate it. "Something about those conditions," wrote Dr. Lyle Chambers, "cannot exist without the immediacy of mortality." His paper was never published, but his private note echoed Carter's myth. Maybe he wasn't defying death. Maybe he just forgot it mattered. Even Rommel's archives, captured after the war, contained a quiet nod. One of his adjutants, writing from memory, recorded the field report from the Tunisia front. "We expected 20 minutes of resistance. They gave us 3 days. If the enemy had 10 more like them, Africa would have been lost." The entry ends with a single sentence underlined twice: "Some battles are not fought by men, but by their ghosts." And perhaps that's the essence of the contrast. On one side, the logic of armies, numbers, speed, fuel, and shells. On the other, the illogic of spirit, belief without proof, endurance without reason. Hill 609 was where those two collided. The result wasn't victory or defeat, but distortion. Machines faltered, time stretched, and the very sand seemed unwilling to yield. Modern analysts revisiting the campaign tried to rationalize it. They argued that weather conditions, terrain, and German overconfidence combined to create the illusion of greater resistance. But even they couldn't explain why Carter's body remained upright for days, or why eyewitnesses from both sides described the same vision, a lone figure still visible through smoke long after all gunfire ceased. The final Army audit of the battle, published quietly in 1949, summarized it with unusual poetry. At Hill 609, the line between endurance and eternity disappeared. Whether by will or coincidence, one platoon became the hinge of fate. That sentence closed the file, but not the story. Because every generation of soldiers who studied that file felt something stir in them, an understanding that courage is not measured in victory but in refusal. And though the names fade, the image remains a soldier facing east, eyes open, body refusing collapse. The desert has turned that stance into geometry, the point where physics bent to accommodate faith. And as the wind continues to comb through those dunes, reshaping them, erasing footprints, it always stops at one ridge. The sand there refuses to cover the past. Instruments still fail nearby, radios hum faintly when no one speaks, and compasses twist ever so slightly east. That is the direction Carter faced, the direction of duty, of dawn, of unfinished orders. Outsmarted, outflanked, outgunned, yes, but never outwatched. For even now, when light hits the ridge at the right angle, a shadow stands a little taller than the rest, fixed against the horizon, refusing to fade. ChatGPT said, when the war finally turned and the desert fell silent, the news of victory carried little comfort to those who had seen the ridge. By April of 1943, Tunisia had become a graveyard of steel, its valleys filled with the skeletons of tanks and men alike. The Allied press printed triumphal headlines, "Axis routed in North Africa." But among the officers who'd walked the sand of Hill 609 celebration came with an ache. They knew what the reports never mentioned. They'd seen the price. They'd seen the impossible. Weeks after the battle, a convoy of jeeps returned to collect the final remains. The men in charge moved slowly, carefully, stepping around shell holes that still smoked from buried munitions. One of them, Captain Ernest Mallory, had been the first to report Carter's posture to command. When he arrived again, the desert looked cleaner, quieter, but emptier too, as if something essential had departed. He noted it in his journal. The ridge no longer watches us. It feels blind now. They dug, cataloged, photographed. Mallory took a moment to look east, the direction the dead had faced, and saw what looked like shimmered heat rising above the horizon. But there was no heat that day. The wind was cool, dry, almost kind. A mirage, he whispered to himself, though he couldn't shake the idea that the mirage was looking back. Later that afternoon, one of his men, a private named Lowell, called him over. "Sir, I think you should see this." In the sand where Carter's weapon had once been fixed, a faint groove had appeared, as though something had dragged the barrel an inch forward just once. No footprints, no marks, only that single motion frozen in earth. Mallory ordered it filled. He didn't mention it in his final report. Back in Algiers, the headquarters briefings had already turned to Sicily and the next invasion. The war machine moved forward, devouring yesterday's miracles as fuel for tomorrow's plans. But the echo of Hill 609 lingered. Letters from the field began to circulate among officers. Have you ever seen a man die standing? Do you believe the dead can hold ground? Each line was half question, half confession. Commanders tried to suppress them, fearing that stories like that might turn the war from science back into superstition. But soldiers aren't machines, and whispers travel faster than orders. By 1944, Carter's name had become shorthand for endurance. Pull a Carter, they'd say, meaning stand your ground, no matter what. The expression spread quietly through the 34th, through the 1st Armored, even into British and Free French units. It appeared in graffiti on tank hulls, scratched into helmets, whispered in foxholes. Pull a Carter. Few of them knew who he was, but all knew what it meant. That was the legacy, unofficial, unrecorded, but alive. Even as the war moved to Europe, as forests replaced sand and snow replaced dust, the idea survived. Men facing impossible odds invoked him like a charm. And when they did, something seemed to happen: confidence where there should have been fear, clarity where there should have been chaos. Some called it coincidence. Others, communion. Years after the armistice, the men who'd survived the North African campaign gathered for reunions. They'd sit in smoke-filled halls, drink too much, and tell stories that drifted between fact and fever dream. Hill 609 always surfaced by midnight. Mallory would describe the body still upright, the wind tugging at the flag sewn to its sleeve. Jensen would talk about Carter's last words, though no one had heard them. He swore he could guess. Something simple, he'd say. Something like, "still watching." And when silence fell, someone would mutter that maybe the man never stopped. By the 1950s, The U.S. Army had commissioned a formal review of unexplained incidents during the war. Statistical anomalies, unclassified mechanical failures, human endurance cases that defied medical record. Carter's file resurfaced. The committee debated, filed it under psychophysiological anomaly, no further research. But one scientist, Dr. Robert Kell, refused to let it go. He studied postural rigidity, shock-induced catatonia, desert mirage phenomena. His conclusion was clinical, but laced with awe. Whatever happened at Hill 609 was not mystical. It was the farthest reach of human will. He didn't die standing, he stopped living in the process of standing. He presented it once to an audience of generals. None applauded. Meanwhile, the desert continued its slow reclamation. Vultures nested in the broken shells of tanks. Thorn bushes grew where trenches once ran. And yet each year after the spring rains, the same strange thing occurred. The sand above Carter's burial site hardened into a pattern like ripples pointing east, while the surrounding dunes remained soft. Pilots flying overhead during training noticed it a darker ridge that caught the dawn earlier than the rest. Satellite images later confirmed it. The sunlight reached that patch of ground 40 seconds before any other point in the valley. No one could explain the angle of reflection that caused it. The French kept a small outpost nearby during the colonial years. Patrol logs mention radios cutting out dogs refusing to cross the ridge at night. A young lieutenant wrote, "The air hums here. It feels like a presence." The commanding officer ordered him transferred. 2 months later, the same entry appeared in another soldier's notebook. "The air hums. By 1960, the outpost was abandoned, but the notebooks survived. Then came the visitors, the curious, the haunted, the desperate for meaning. Pilgrims of a new kind, veterans, priests, even scientists, disguised as tourists. Some left stones, others prayers. A few claimed to see what the soldiers of 1943 had seen, a figure on the crest at dawn, faint and unwavering. Cameras captured nothing but glare, but testimonies multiplied. The legend grew legs again. For the families of the fallen, the truth was simpler, but no less sacred. Carter's mother, living in Alabama, received his effects by mail dog tags, a burnt pocket Bible, a folded letter unsent. She opened it years later when her hands had grown too shaky to farm. The words were short, steady, written in pencil, faded by sweat. "Ma, the sand here sings when the wind blows. It sounds like home. If I don't make it, tell them I kept watch." She wept quietly, then placed the letter beneath a photograph of him smiling in uniform. For the rest of her life, she would light a candle every February facing east. And in that gesture, the mother mirroring the sun, the story became complete. The living keeping vigil for the dead who refused to rest. One watching from Earth, the other from the space beyond sound. But history doesn't like loose ends. When the Army prepared its official chronicle of the North African campaign, editors debated whether to include. "It's unverifiable," one said. "Unnecessary," said another. But a young writer fresh from college argued otherwise. "We owe them the ink," he said. His section survived a single printing run before being replaced in later editions. Yet his words echoed the spirit that numbers could never capture. In a place where physics failed and courage endured, a man stood guard over the idea that duty ends only when remembered. By the 1970s, veterans began returning to Tunisia in small groups. They came with canes, medals, old maps. At the ridge, they planted an American flag, small and worn. The wind tore it within hours. They replaced it again year after year. Each time the flag fell faster, until one day they stopped bringing flags altogether. They just stood there in silence, facing east, saluting the empty horizon. The payoff wasn't triumph, it was realization. That the war's true monuments aren't built of marble, but of moments where men refused to vanish. That the ridge, stripped of its sound and fury, had become the shape of endurance itself. Carter didn't die for a cause printed on pamphlets or speeches. He died because the man next to him needed one more heartbeat of cover. In that heartbeat lay the hinge of history. When Captain Mallory died in 1978, his son found a single line scrawled on the last page of his notebook, "He's still out there." The handwriting shook, the ink bled, but the sentence stood. That became the final whisper among those who knew the creed of the forgotten platoon. And so long after the tanks rusted into bones and the sky cleared of gunpowder, the world kept turning. The story faded from textbooks but survived in the pulse of every soldier who ever stood a lonely post at dawn. For in every watchtower, every foxhole, every checkpoint beneath a sleepless sky, there is a man who feels it, the unseen presence at his shoulder, the quiet assurance that he is not alone. That is the aftermath of Hill 609. Not ghosts, not glory, just continuity. A bridge between the living and the fallen, between what ends and what refuses to. The war ended. The ridge did not. And in the silence that followed, the desert kept its promise. Somewhere beneath that sand, still facing east, a soldier remains at his post, waiting for the next dawn to break. What if he had not stayed? What if the ridge had fallen when logic said it should, and the enemy had swept through unchallenged? Would the war in North Africa have ended differently, or would history have quietly rewritten itself around a missing name? Questions like these echo across the dunes where the wind still remembers. The sand has shifted 1,000 times, but the faint line where he stood remains etched deeper than memory, older than reason. Pilots call it the standing line. It is not on any map yet. Every veteran who once fought in the desert knows exactly where it lies. At dawn, the light always finds it first. The locals say the earth remembers its watcher. Scientists say the slope catches the sun earlier by angle alone. But belief and mathematics are not enemies here. They coexist, circling one another like twin shadows. When dusk falls, the wind rises and carries the same rhythm. The soldiers once knew the rattle of empty shell casings, the whisper of dry grass brushing metal. And if you stand there long enough, the wind begins to speak not in words, but in pulse. Still watching, still holding. The ridge is quiet now, but not silent. It hums softly like breath under the sand. Visitors feel it before they see it. Their footsteps slow, their voices lower. One woman, granddaughter of a man who fought there, described it perfectly. It's like stepping into a cathedral with no roof, only memory. She left a small cross at the crest. When she returned a year later, the cross was gone. In its place lay 3 bullets polished bright by wind. Far away in a sterile cemetery where names are listed in marble, Carter's is carved near the bottom. Private Elijah Carter, 34th Infantry Division. But beside it, faintly and unaccountably, 2 words were added in smaller letters, still standing. The engraver swore he didn't write them. The curator never authorized it. The words remain untouched, cleaned every spring, but never erased. In 1983, a film crew came to record the story of forgotten battles. They captured nothing extraordinary until their last morning. As the sun rose, the camera lens flared white. In that burst of glare stood a shape human in height, motionless against the horizon. The cameraman called it a trick of light. But the editor weeks later stopped the reel on frame 244 and froze. There it was, a silhouette, faint and upright, facing east. They left it in unmentioned. Let the film speak for itself. Then came the digital age. The story resurfaced, flickering through screens and circuits. Someone uploaded Carter's photograph, the grainy image of the ridge, and within days it spread like a whispered prayer. Forums lit with arguments, science against myth, discipline against faith. Historians invoked dehydration, hallucination, physics. Veterans simply wrote, "You weren't there." And beneath every thread, an anonymous reply appeared identical each time, still on watch. No IP trace, no name. Only that sentence, as if the past itself had learned to type. Engineers building communication towers near Kasserine still report signal loss around the ridge. Compass needles twitch east. Drones drift off course. A technician once noted in his report, "unknown interference," felt observed. He deleted that line before submission, but months later he began sketching the same image over and over again, a man with squared shoulders, rifle at rest, eyes forward. He didn't know why. In a war museum in Virginia, behind glass, lies a melted Browning receiver, labeled "Recovered Tunisia 1943. Few notice it. Fewer know that it belonged to Carter. But those who pause before it describe the same sensation, a pressure in the air, like standing too close to a heartbeat that isn't yours. The placard says, "Do not touch," yet fingerprints keep appearing on the glass even after cleaning. Every war leaves an afterlife, some in monuments, some in nightmares. Hill 609's afterlife lives in vibration, in static, in wind, in memory. Soldiers still tell the story during night watch. The man who died standing. They say not for ghosts, but for guidance. Because deep down they understand the story isn't about death, it's about refusal. The refusal to break, to bow, to disappear. A Marine visiting in 2003 wrote in his journal, "I felt him. Not saw, not heard. Felt. Like gravity shifted for a second, and someone else carried the weight for me. 2 months later he fell in another desert half a world away. They found his notebook on his chest. The final line holding the line. That's what remains, not the man, not the weapon, but the posture. The act of standing when all reason says fall. Each generation inherits that shape, that defiance. Carter's name fades, but his outline stays repeated in every soldier who looks toward the horizon and decides not to flinch. What if they hadn't underestimated them? What if Rommel's army had understood that you cannot outflank conviction, that courage once lit burns beyond flesh? The campaigns would have looked different, but the lesson would be the same. Steel may advance, but spirit endures. And sometimes spirit wins. The desert is not empty. It is full of echoes. Every gust of wind carries the fragments of orders shouted long ago. Every grain of sand holds the imprint of boots that refuse to retreat. And in that eternal rhythm, the story repeats itself endlessly. There was a platoon that held their ground, a man who refused to fall a ridge that refused to forget. The world may not speak his name, but the earth does every dawn in the language of light and dust. Somewhere beyond the horizon, where war ends and memory begins, a figure still stands unchanged, unbroken, watching the sunrise for the 83rd time since his heartbeat stopped. The wind bends around him, never through him. The sand moves, but never buries. The silence hums with vigilance. He asks for nothing. He wants no witness. His duty is simple: to keep the line between fear and courage intact. And so he remains forever keeping his post, forever facing the east. So if you ever find yourself in the deserts of Tunisia at dawn, stop. Listen. The air might quiver. The horizon might seem straighter than before. And if the world feels a little steadier beneath your feet, it's because somewhere beyond sight, beyond time, Private Elijah Carter is still there standing guard, so the rest of us don't have to. You've just heard another forgotten file from Echoes of the Unknown, a story of duty that outlived its heartbeat. Before you go, share where you're listening from, and subscribe so when history whispers again, you'll be here to hear it.